God of War 2018 already dropped a few rungs down my shit ladder with its name. You want to call a reboot the same name title as the first? Fine. It's annoying because we have to append the unofficial subtitle of whatever year in which the bloody thing came out on the end of it, but fine. But God of War 2018 hinges on actually being a continuation of the existing series, meaning we now have two games called the exact same thing in the same continuity. If that's not a sure sign that the communists have won, I don't know what is, but I'll come back to that. What really made me break out the long tongues for picking up God of War 2018 was that all the hoity-toity story, ooga-booga gram fix, and massive present interaction with your young and hopeful and impressionable son looked like it wasn't just packing the God of War label in the attic. The label was chloroformed and left in the attic of a burning house as some bandit drove away with God of War's credit cards and jockstraps, which is basically a fancy way of saying it didn't look like God of War, one of my most beloved gaming franchises. Worried as I am that this could be a tragic case of the game forgetting that the main character of any video game is the player, I'll mainly be reviewing the gameplay of God of War fucking 2018. I won't talk about the story much because 1, it's kind of tough to discuss without spoilers, and 2, it's fine. Nothing really to quibble about, though I will caution you to lower your expectations if you're expecting anywhere near the pantheon proportions of God of War 3. 2018's game is more of a stroll in the park rather than chopping watermelons on a roller coaster. So perhaps the biggest tweak to the gameplay is the camera position. While the original games had a voyeuristic fixed camera perspective that was like playing via a series of CCTV cameras, God of War 2018 has a manually controlled over-the-shoulder Last of Us camera, like the Otso on your shoulder is streaming your escapades to Twitch. Which actually might be an appropriate simile because the game has this one-shot thing going on where it's one continuous take from long menu to roll credits, assuming you don't die and restart. And considering the technology on display here you can obviously see on the screen is very impressive, even though the Dead Space games already did that with exponentially less fanfare a decade ago, but it's always awkward when you're called upon to perform a contextual action mid-cutscene, given how there's never a clean break between cinematic and gameplay. You're never quite sure if you should be hitting buttons or if Kratos is a real boy making his own decisions. But let's talk about when you are hitting buttons, specifically with the combat, which is kind of like riding a horse while wearing an eye patch. Rather than the classic sort of controlled chaos of the past, combat is much more closer range, focusing on Kratos' new axe, Leviathan, which can be thrown and recalled like Thor's hammer is the obvious simile everyone jumps to. The over-the-shoulder camera isn't great for melee combat, and judging the distance between you and the enemy currently holding the interview can be a consistent issue. A problem somewhat fixed by the more exciting second weapon, but the inescapable plague the camera leaves us stricken with is the fact that at any given time, a third of the screen is taken up by Kratos' meaty shoulders, and there's only so many enemies you can see at one given moment. This is God of War, of course, meaning malicious mobs are a menu mainstay, and the restricted perspective seems rather arbitrary, and the game agrees. It's trying to pick up the slack with a heads-up display indicator to show you where the enemies are about to slit you open like a baked potato, but it is not great. The game directly upping the volume of your headset 3 notches while it shouts the directions in your ear might be better. The arrows are kind of messy and difficult to gauge at a glance, but the indicator has bizarre blind spots to your immediate sides, which leads to a number of unanticipatable bushwhackings because the arrows won't pop up. An icon appears the moment an enemy begins their attack, with no distinction made between enemies with wind-ups like Jack-in-the-Boxes with frozen steel cranks and enemies who attack with a snap of their fingers. And considering the very minute amount of invincibility frames you have while dodging, knowing when to mash dodge like the button will jumpstart your life support is an inexact science in itself that will more often than not result in you being served fully loaded with a side of butter. But like the eye patch horse riding I mentioned, though it's a bit tricky at first, you'll eventually get to a point where you can look badass while doing it. Once you unlock some meaty rune attacks, pick some skills off the trees, and your boy can start pulling his weight with an admirable gusto in combat, all of which improve your overall level. It does have a consistent problem even then of relatively low enemy variety, especially in the sub-bosses, which is where God of War usually Wait, did I say levels? Yes, because God of War is more of an action RPG now, for some reason. Enemies drop resources you can use to buy or upgrade armor, which in turn redresses Kratos' stats. But it's not as extensive as it likes to believe. The combat never really changes up drastically from any finagling you might do. The RPG elements just feel too light to do more than cautiously nudge the gameplay in a more satisfactory direction, like you're trying to get a sleeping cat off a magazine, but they're emphasized and present enough to make a bulk of your rewards feel absolutely useless because they don't fit your desired build. It doesn't really do much more than serve as some way to provide a sense of reward for pillaging every Norse nook, which is the real second half of the gameplay. While story missions mostly stick to linearity, the game does expand itself via a hub area you'll return to every now and then. Each time, the game openly challenging you to stray from the beaten path, each doggable beach calling out like sirens, balancing stacks of pancakes on their busts. But you might as well put it off, because while you can conceivably find every place worth finding on the second trip back, you can only loot about 50% of them at that point because you need all the gizmos you get from the story path to find everything. And even then, it's a 30-70 shot whatever island you dock on has something you'll actually use, given the aforementioned RPG pretensions that, as we've established, add as much as water does to a bottle of Dasani. Certainly not enough to add replayability to the game, which I feel like it kinda lacks. This exploration verb comes packaged with the Souls series inspiration in that the world feels distinctly indifferent to your presence. It's a bit of a jarring shift from the likes of God of War 3's world-ending catastrophe. Not to say the game doesn't have stakes, it's just more of a personal story, focusing on the relationship between Kratos and Boy, which helps keep investment in the story strong and propels the later action. Possibly a contentious opinion here, I prefer Kratos and Boy's relationship to something like Joel and Ellie from The Last of Us. Well, that's kind of a predictable old man and young child become family story. God of War has that angle with the modification that Kratos and his son are already family, which sounds like starting at the end, but the solid writing effectively portrays them both as strangers brought together by circumstance. And the game is actually the funniest game I've played in years.
And I will start with that statue over my father's grave.
Unlikely. You are dead.
Throw in the excellent sound design, Bear McCreary's score was the real thing to anticipate from this game launching, and the impressive graphics on display. And God of War is a fine time, but what I keep getting stuck on is this ubiquitous Game of the Generation label. While I do agree, I don't agree in the same all aboard the SS Dick Suck bandwagon the way most people do. What I mean is that God of War 2018 feels like a game of the generation. Like it cherry-picked all the items from the buffet that got the best reviews on Metacritic. We have the story and character focus of The Last of Us, the laissez-faire exploration and shoulder-button combat of Soulsborne, the set pieces of Uncharted, the XP and skill trees from every game, and every game's CAD. God of War 2018's identity just feels like it borrows a bit too often and too heavily from other titles, and at the end of the day doesn't really add much to the overall cultural zeitgeist. It feels kind of like a communist game, ordering all the big titles to provide their best features for the proletariat, and haha, I told you communism would return in this video. I could feel the community that gave the Washington Post a hot magma enema for not liking Uncharted 4 enough creeping up behind me. So let me close by saying that God of War isn't a bad game, but if we are due for another trilogy, it behooves Sony Santa Monica to buck another established series norm by not recycling the gameplay wholesale for the sequels. Because while a cloak fashion from other people's skin might be chic for one night out, by the second night it starts to smell and the vegans start giving you funny looks.